Make America healthy again? That has been the slogan for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. ever since he joined President Trump's bid for re-election. And this movement, Make America Healthy Again, otherwise known as MAHA, has gained a lot of traction on podcasts, among alt health influencers, and especially on Twitter. But what's its deal? Do they have a point? Does the MAHA movement identify real problems and offer real solutions? And is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. a guy who thinks that vaccines cause autism, that Wi-Fi causes cancer, that chemtrails are real, and that HIV doesn't cause AIDS, the person to fix those problems? Hi, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to another debunking video. I usually cover vaccine and biology-related misinformation on this channel, but I'm covering today an episode of the Joe Rogan podcast where he had Callie and Cassie Means on to discuss the MAHA movement. They make a lot of claims relevant to the medical field and agriculture and just overall health. I'm not a medical doctor. I have a PhD. I do research. I don't treat patients. But throughout this video, I'm going to be including input that I asked my friends for who do have expertise in the medical field and agriculture field and etc. And I'll be crediting them throughout the video and in the description below. Also in the description will be all of the links to all of the science that I talk about in this video. With that said, let's jump right in and get started.
Let's just bring it down to the facts of what's happening to kids. Let's bring it down to just like, let's forget the conspiracy theory, what even anyone's saying in this room. Let's look what's happening to our food and look what's happening to kids. Because by the stats we're seeing, there's something really dark happening. Like outside any conspiracy theory, just the statistics of what is happening to our health in this country and uniquely in America is dark.
So this is why I think the MAHA movement is gaining so much traction, because they are tapping into things that are real. America does have problems, and we do face genuine challenges with our health. We do have challenges with obesity. We do have challenges with mental health. These things are real. However, it's not quite as dark as what Callie paints it to be. A big theme to be remembered throughout this video is that one of the big reasons that we're facing these problems as much as we are today is because we don't have to worry about older problems that we've eliminated, or at least problems that have been heavily reduced and there's a lot less suffering and death from them. For example, infectious disease in America used to be a massive problem and a big killer of children especially. Diseases like tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, yellow fever have all been dealt with to the point where we practically don't ever even encounter them thanks to vaccines. Diseases like cholera are practically unheard of thanks to sanitation and antibiotics. Even a more recent infectious disease like HIV used to be a death sentence back in the 1980s, early 1990s. But now, thanks to antivirals, we have averted millions of deaths to HIV, and it is no longer a death sentence. It's now a manageable disease, even though it can still be difficult to live with it. Childhood cancers used to be a much bigger problem than they are now. Now we have 80% of children with cancers going on to live full lives, thanks to big advances in chemotherapies. Thanks to these and many more advances in modern medicine and society in general, more people than ever are able to live healthier lives. So when someone like this is telling you to look at the facts, you have to look at all the facts, not just the ones that are scary and spooky and will get you riled up to support their cause. It's important to acknowledge that we are facing new and significant challenges today, but we have to go into it with a clear mind and make sure we acknowledge the things that did bring us great benefits and get us to this point so that we don't move backwards. And in order to do that, we have to look at data.
The data and put pieces together. But of course, we're not trained to connect dots. That's not our job in medicine. We are trained to follow algorithms and to be reactive.
Well, medical doctors aren't necessarily taught how to interpret data and do research. Many do learn that, but not all. That's what scientists do. Scientists are trained to design studies, to gather data, and then objectively analyze that data to make conclusions about our natural world. And then other scientists try to design better experiments in order to either tear down those conclusions or vindicate them, whatever the data may be. And I point this out because Casey seems to be making this point that medical doctors aren't taught how to interpret science or think for themselves, but that's not really true. Lots of medical doctors who end up practicing for a really long time do end up getting involved in science. They do end up participating in studies, and they do have to keep up with the literature in order to give their patients the best care. I know not all medical doctors do that, but what she is doing is not really fair to most medical doctors, and she's making a distinction between medical doctors and scientists, which do have separate and distinct jobs.
Are we going to make the effort and be courageous enough to fight for this? Or are we going to let ourselves be told that there's nothing wrong, nothing to see here, while our health and the health of the planet is just absolutely being destroyed?
Again, Casey here seems to be putting up a straw man. Nobody is saying that there's nothing to see here, no problem. The obesity epidemic and a lot of the chronic diseases that are issues in America right now are very much acknowledged and studied heavily in America and all around the world. They are being acknowledged. They're just difficult problems to tackle. But like all difficult problems, we are tackling them, and it will take time to improve. But more on that later. Surely if Callie and Casey here are going to tear down the modern medical establishment and rebuild it with MAHA, they must understand the current state of things, right? They must understand the recommendations and the data to support them and all of that, right?
I was just reading the other day that California, the medical board, is checking the licenses of doctors, putting them under review if they write 5 vaccine exception notes. You literally are like on the verge of losing your license if you even go outside the orthodoxy on vaccines.
No, that's just not true. The law that he's referencing is this California code here, and all it's saying is that under certain circumstances, physicians who write more than 5 medical exemptions for vaccines, those medical exemptions are just going to be reviewed by the health department. That's it. It doesn't say anything about doctors being on thin ice or about to lose their license or anything like that. Just that those medical exemptions will be reviewed at least annually by the health department.
But where is that level of emphasis? Where is that level of focus? Where is that level of rigor around metabolic health for kids, around nutrition for kids, right? I think it is a big deal, like, of kids getting polio, but like 50% of teens are obese or overweight right now.
50? Well, the numbers are more like 1 in 3. Still not great, but throwing out inflated stats like that is not a good look. And there is a lot of rigor and attention into childhood obesity. I don't think there's a single pediatrician out there who is going to tell a kid to not eat healthy and to not exercise. I shouldn't say that. There probably are some weird pediatricians out there, but most of them are going to tell kids to be in a healthy weight. Every medical society thinks that this is an issue, and billions of research dollars are spent researching this topic every year in the US. It would be one thing to say that you want more research into children's health and obesity. That is a conversation we can definitely have. But making up laws to get people mad about vaccines in order to do that is totally unnecessary and strikes me as dishonest.
The American Diabetes Association says that if you have diabetes, you don't need to worry about your sugar intake. They say it's not tied to food.
What? No, they don't. They tell you to avoid foods with added sugar. Why are you making this up?
Right. The American Academy of Pediatrics right now is saying that if your child is overweight, slightly overweight, 12 years old, dietary interventions don't wait. It says do not wait to see if dietary interventions work. Ozempic.
That's also not true. The American Academy of Pediatrics specifically recommends that pharmacotherapy may be used in children with obesity as an adjunct to health and behavior lifestyle treatment. And that treatment includes a focus on increasing healthful food consumption, participating in physical activity, and enjoyment for self-care reasons. If you want to tear down the medical industry and replace it with something new, you probably should understand what the medical industry is recommending right now, and not just pretend that the experts are treating obesity as a non-issue, when they definitely are. These guidelines are free to read, but I think their strategy here is to overload the audience, including Joe Rogan, with information that sounds good so that they don't actually ever check it for themselves.
The American Psychiatry Association, right? The psychiatrist, the standard of care. If your child is a little sad, SSRI.
See what I mean? This is also just a lie. There are standard guidelines for diagnosing anxiety and depression in children. And the clinical guidelines specifically outline that if clinically significant anxiety or depression is present in a child, then the first line of treatment should be cognitive behavioral therapy or some other form of evidence-based treatment for their mental conditions. And SSRIs are an alternative treatment consideration, particularly for children who present with more severe symptoms. I'm not on SSRIs anymore, but I once was, and they did help me get through a really dark time in my life where every day genuinely felt like a crushing struggle, and it felt like nothing was ever going to get better. And while I wasn't a child when I got on them, they were not prescribed to me willy-nilly. I did have to get assessed by multiple people, and it was an important decision to make. They don't help everybody, but they helped me, and they help a lot of people. So to sit there and demonize SSRIs as something that is weird to take or something that people shouldn't be taking is just, it's uncaring. It's ignorant. And I don't think these are the people who are going to make America healthy again if these are the stances they're taking.
Right? It's not asking whether they're in the sunlight, not asking if they're too sedentary, not asking if they're being force-fed ultra-processed food, which would make any animal crazy if we subject them to what kids are subjected to. No discussion of that. It's just not in the clinical guidelines.
It specifically is. Clinical guidelines specifically include reduction of sugary beverages, reducing a sedentary lifestyle, including playing outdoors, and getting proper sleep. He's just not right about the clinical guidelines. Is it because he doesn't care enough to actually read them? Or does he know better, and is he just not telling the truth? I'll let you decide.
If we had people on Medicaid, instead of jamming with the statins, jamming them with Ozempic, jamming them with SSRIs, lower income people, we're going bankrupt from Medicaid, $1.3 trillion. It's growing. It's a bigger part of the budget than the defense budget. If we literally just asked, how do we have that money to spur thriving, to incentivize exercise, to incentivize healthier food for these folks, we'd be a transformed country. It's literally that simple.
It's really not that simple. Every doctor will tell you, and it is common knowledge, that you should eat well and exercise in order to be generally healthy. The problem isn't that people don't know these things, and they correctly say later in the podcast that people want to be healthy. Nobody wants to be unhealthy and out of shape and just generally not feeling good. But a lot of these things are easier said than done, and because it is a difficult problem, there are a lot of people preying on those looking for solutions by giving them false solutions. Look at all the fad diet and exercise crazes that go on. Look at all the fad wellness tactics or biohacks that gain so much popularity online and make trillions of dollars for a huge wellness industry. So much of it is not science-based. The reality is there's just no quick fix to these things. Some people can see results with fad exercises or fad diets, and that is a good thing, but studies consistently show that if people go off of these fad diets or exercises, they put weight right back on. And that's just one piece of the entire body of scientific literature that does paint a pretty clear picture, which is that eating habits are just as important as what you actually eat. If you're a vegan that eats 3,000 calories in a day and doesn't get much exercise, you might not be that healthy. Similarly, if you exercise a lot, but you don't eat enough food and you end up with a nutrient deficiency, that can be an issue too. There are so many factors that affect eating habits, and not all of them are within your control. For example, if we overlay a map of obesity in the United States with poverty in the United States, they match up really well because there genuinely is a significant correlation between poverty and being obese. So just where you're born in the US can significantly affect your chances of how healthy you are. And the reasons for this correlation and causal association are multifactorial. These factors include, but are not limited to, food insecurity and food deserts contributing to affordability of food, and access to convenient and safe methods of exercise. So if you want to tackle this big problem, you have to talk about these fundamental problems that have huge influences over a person's health. I think that's where the MAHA movement really misses. But one of the things that I do think they hit on and are correct about is that corporations are not innocent here. Food corporations in a capitalist society have a vested interest in selling you the most delicious, most addictive food that will keep you coming back and buying more and more and more. And let's be honest, food, it slaps. It's good. Food is delicious. And that doesn't make it easier to form healthier eating habits. It's easy to overeat food when it's really good and a lot of it around. Those are the main issues that need to be talked about here, not making up stories about how processed food has dead nutrients that's going to kill your cells. We'll get there. Let's move on.
COVID was a metabolic condition. COVID was a foodborne illness. Like, if you were metabolically healthy, you did not die of COVID, like pretty demonstrably.
Wow. Yeah, that's not true. But this is a tactic that is way too common. He takes a truth and then under it, he slides straight garbage. It's true that having chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, obesity are generally going to make you more vulnerable to infectious disease. That's just a given almost across the board. That doesn't mean that people who are healthy are completely safe from infectious disease. And COVID was no exception. If we break down COVID deaths in the US by comorbidities, we see that the most commonly occurring contributing conditions are things that were caused by COVID. For example, in this chart here, we see 1.1 million COVID deaths as of September 2023. And co-occurring conditions like pneumonia and respiratory failure are things that were caused by COVID. People didn't have respiratory failure before they had COVID. It happened because the virus was literally destroying their lungs, and their lungs were so inflamed and filled with fluid that they couldn't breathe. But if we look down this list and we see things like diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, those things do have pretty high numbers in this list. But there are a lot of people who had no pre-existing or underlying conditions that still suffered and died from COVID. So what Callie said is not demonstrably true. It's demonstrably false. And if we look past the worst metric, which is death, and look at other metrics that are still significant and cause a lot of suffering, like ICU admission and hospitalization, even in kids, about 30% of kids in the US who were hospitalized during the Omicron wave had no underlying conditions. Meanwhile, 90% were unvaccinated. Being unvaccinated was a bigger predictor of whether or not a kid would get hospitalized than whether or not they had underlying conditions. It's just wishful thinking to think that even if we all ate healthy and we all exercised and nobody had type 2 diabetes and everybody was not obese, that we would have no issues with infectious disease. It's just not true.
25% of people are on an SSRI. That's insane.
No, the closest stat to that I could find was women over the age of 60, where 24% of them are on antidepressants, not specifically SSRIs. In total, among adults in the US, about 13% are on antidepressants, not specifically SSRIs. Again, these people are just inflating stats all over the place to make you think there's a bigger problem than what there is.
In midlife, you look at women, and infertility is through the roof. We've got PCOS is affecting 26% of women. This is a metabolic fertility issue.
Okay, so this is part of a larger conversation that Casey is having about infertility here. So the first thing I want to clarify is that fertility rates of a country is not a biological measure. It's a measure of just how many children per woman there are, or on average, how many children each woman is having. And there are a ton of societal factors affecting how many children a woman might want to have. Generally, the more autonomy and education and opportunity that women have in a society, the less they want to have children. And that makes sense. A lot of women are going to want to have careers and do a lot of things in life that are going to be a lot harder or just not going to be able to do if they have 6 kids. If you want to have 6 kids, go for it. It couldn't be me. Having 2 already feels like enough. But these are just things you have to recognize. Not everybody wants 6 kids. And a lot of people don't want any kids, and that's fine too. I just don't want people to conflate fertility rates with something biological, because you could definitely do that by listening to Casey. But then Casey goes on to talk about PCOS, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a common cause of biological infertility, which we also call impaired fecundity. And when she talks about PCOS, she says that 26% of women have it in the US. I don't know where she's getting that. According to the Endocrine Society, about 7 to 10% of women of childbearing age in the US have PCOS. So again, we're seeing this just random inflation of numbers. I don't get it. Anyway, Casey says that PCOS and infertility among women is through the roof. I couldn't find evidence of that. Going back to 1982, looking at impaired fecundity rates among women who have not yet had children, or in other words, nulliparous women, the rates have been pretty stable. For ease of viewing, I put together this chart. The age groups in the studies I looked at don't match up perfectly, but you can see that there aren't huge changes in the rates. And this is consistent with modern studies looking at PCOS rates in women, and they also find that the rates are very stable over time. And just so you know, the medical establishment does recognize lifestyle changes as an important treatment plan for PCOS. Again, it's a combination of lifestyle change recommendations along with medications for severe cases.
There was a recent study that was done that showed 100% of placentas that were dissected had microplastics in them. Again, it's like, how would you even do the study, right, to show that?
Right.
And yet, if you put the pieces together, it's very clear.
So she is correct here. There was a study showing that 100% of placentas dissected in this study had microplastics in them. And there are lots of other studies showing that microplastics are pretty much everywhere. It's probably not great that we have microplastics everywhere, but you can't say that they're specifically causing these problems when you don't know that, when you don't have the data to show that. And you can absolutely design experiments to test whether or not microplastics are causing specific problems in specific situations. I can imagine studies where you dose mice with varying amounts of microplastics and see what happens to them. You could test for microplastics exposures in different populations around the world and see if certain disease rates go up in concert with increased microplastics exposure. There are definitely ways to break this down and answer hard questions. That's what scientists do. That's what they're good at. Just because Casey can't imagine an experiment where we tackle a difficult question doesn't mean that it can't be done. So no, Casey, you can't just push scientific methods to the side and go off of vibes. You have to do the science and figure out these answers before you tell people what the answers are. And if you don't know the answers, you have to be honest, like this. Is it great that we have microplastics everywhere? Probably not. They're probably not good. But do we know exactly what they're doing? We don't know yet. But hey, in the meantime, let's take steps to reduce our plastic use and waste in the environment. That's a good thing to get behind, right? Unfortunately, they don't talk about any ways to do that in this episode.
80% of medical schools in the United States don't require a single nutrition course, not 1 minute of nutrition. And yet 90% of our healthcare costs are tied to diseases. The things that are torturing American lives are tied to food.
Okay, so first of all, a lot of nutrition education is tied into courses about endocrinology and biochemistry when people are going through medical school. There are a lot of faults that you can point out in the medical education system and things to improve on, but it's dishonest to say that doctors come out of medical school knowing nothing about nutrition. Furthermore, once a physician is practicing, they enroll in what's called continuing medical education courses. And those will often include the latest science of nutrition and relevant fields. Doctors are not ignorant. There's a reason they all tell you to eat healthy and exercise.
And Marty Makary talks about this. I certainly didn't learn that medical error and medication is the third leading cause of death in the United States.
You probably weren't taught that in medical school because it's not true. This claim comes from an extremely flawed study published in the British Medical Journal. Essentially what they did was they took a couple of papers that reported what they claimed to be deaths caused by medical error. And from those few studies, they took rates at which medical errors occurred and led to death, and then stretched that statistic and extrapolated it out to the entire nation. One of these studies, for example, was conducted by the Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and it was done in beneficiaries of Medicare who are aged 65 or older. This obviously is not representative of all deaths that occur in all hospitals in the nation. It's like if I wanted to figure out what percentage of Americans liked White Claw. White Claw! And so I handed a survey out to people at one concert at Coachella, and from that concluded that 85% of Americans like White Claw. That obviously wouldn't be true, and it's a similar problem here. This study way overestimated the number of medical errors leading to deaths in the US. Studies from other countries reported a much lower rate, contradicting this poorly designed study. I mean, it's just absurd to think that medical errors would be the third leading cause of death. It just takes a little bit of thinking about it and a little bit of digging into the data. But again, Casey seems to want to go off vibes and connecting dots more than just looking at data.
I think before that, people just put all their faith in doctors. And then I think COVID happened and people lost a lot of faith in the medical system. They lost a lot of faith in the NIH. They saw all the contradictory videos of Fauci saying, you're not going to catch COVID, and Rachel Maddow.
I see this a lot, so let me explain my take as a scientist. If you listen to people like Fauci and Biden say you're not going to get COVID if you get the vaccine, and you honestly believe they meant that you have a 100% chance of not getting COVID, then you just weren't paying attention. Should they have said it that way? Absolutely not. It was bad communication. But if you look at the context of what else they said in those conversations and similar conversations they had, it was clear that they did not think that COVID vaccines were going to protect you 100% from the virus. Even the clinical trials themselves showed a 95% reduction in symptomatic COVID, meaning that there were still people in the clinical trials who got the vaccine who also tested positive for COVID and had symptoms. It was definitely bad communication from health authorities and from politicians. But what did the science say? The science said that the main goal of COVID vaccines, just like any vaccine, is to protect you against disease. It's to keep you out of the hospital, keep you out of the ICU, and keep you out of the morgue. And COVID vaccines did that really well. But then you might wonder, well, I got the measles vaccine or the polio vaccine, and I never test positive for measles or polio. So what's the difference? Why is the COVID vaccine so much worse? It's actually not the vaccine. It has more to do with the pathogen. More specifically, it has to do with the pathogen's incubation period, or the time between when the pathogen infects you to the time you actually get symptoms. For viruses like SARS-CoV-2 and influenza, that can be as short as 2 to 3 days. But for a virus like measles, it takes much longer. It takes about 10 days for measles to show symptoms after you're infected. And the way a vaccine works is it exposes your body to a piece of the virus, what we call an antigen. Your body recognizes that antigen as foreign and mounts an immune response to it. That immune response includes a lot of antibodies against that antigen going into your blood a few days after you get exposed to the vaccine. It's your body training itself to fight off and recognize that antigen. But over time, those levels of antibody in your blood are going to hit a peak and then decrease and then plateau. But when those antibody levels lower and plateau, then your body has to rely more on its immune memory to get rid of the virus. Getting that immune memory into gear means a lot of cell signaling and a lot of cell division in order to get your cells at a good enough number that they can circulate around your body and fight off the virus. And that's going to take at least a few days, typically on the order of about a week or so. Your cells aren't that fast, but they are fast enough to stop a virus like SARS-CoV-2 and influenza before it gets to your lower lungs, which is when the disease can get really serious. That's the kind of situation where you're going to end up having trouble breathing, your blood oxygen levels are going to drop, and you're going to probably go into the hospital or ICU. That's the situation that vaccines and immune memory are really protecting you against. It just comes down to the incubation period. Again, viruses like polio and measles take time in order to actually cause the symptoms associated with their disease. In those cases, your immune memory kicks in and clears the virus, and you never knew you even had it. But a respiratory virus like SARS-CoV-2 with a short incubation period that we're constantly testing for, you're going to notice when you have it. This was not communicated well by the CDC, by health authorities, by most people. But that is the reality. And what we have is a situation where people take those bad communications by health authorities, they clip them, they send them all over the internet, and they let their emotions cloud their judgment and not actually look into the topic to see what is the truth here. It's a strategy of misinforming people, and it worked. It worked on Joe Rogan, and Callie and Casey Means are definitely exploiting it. But make no mistake, the science is extremely clear here. COVID vaccines did what they were intended to do, whether or not you understand what they were intended to do.
Sprayed with 10,000 chemicals that are allowed in the United States when only 400 are allowed in Europe. And that food is absolutely, and we don't need to wait for the research on this, these chemicals, these neurotoxins are destroying our cells, destroying our microbiome in ways we don't fully understand.
No, that is not correct at all. There are not 10,000 chemicals that we spray on our food. There are 10,000 products, meaning brands, off-label brands, things like that, of pesticides and herbicides. There are 1,000 different herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, etc. that are used in the US. It doesn't mean they're used frequently, and it doesn't mean they're used on all crops. In many instances, only 1 or 2 are needed. And this comparison to Europe is always just so disingenuous. The US uses about 2.5 kilograms of pesticides per hectare of cropland. France and Spain use 3.6. Belgium uses 6.7. Ireland uses 6.5. Italy uses 6.1. You get the picture. In total, the EU uses about 1.84 times the amount of pesticides per unit of farmland than the US. But let's talk about these pesticides for a second. 99% of the pesticides you consume are completely natural. Mother Nature makes pesticides too. Plants can't run away from predators, so they have to make pesticides in order to protect themselves against bugs, for example. These natural plant pesticides are present in much higher concentrations in your food than any residual chemical that is sprayed. Pesticides and herbicides are also really important for public health. There are lots of plants that grow as pests that can get into your food during harvest and can be harmful if you consume them. This used to be a bigger problem back in the day, but now it's not because, guess what? We made things better. These pests include things like Jimson weed, which can be lethal in high doses and can cause people to go to the hospital whenever there's an outbreak in any one particular crop. There's snake root, which famously killed Abraham Lincoln's mother. And there's ergot, which you might have heard of as being responsible for lots of mysterious cases of mass psychosis sprinkled throughout history. In the United States, we generally don't have to worry about these things anymore. And there's a reason for that. A consistent theme from this MAHA movement has been trying to take away things that genuinely have improved our health over the years. You cannot keep America healthy, let alone make America healthy again, if you take away things like vaccines, if you take away things like pesticides and herbicides that are vitally important to our crops. And without pesticides and herbicides, we wouldn't be able to grow as much food, and food insecurity would be even more of a problem, meaning there would be more food deserts and likely more chronic disease and more obesity. Because making it so that farmers have a harder time growing their crops means people would have less food security. It's just crazy that in order to believe this conspiracy, you have to believe that most scientists and doctors and high-ranking institutions are corrupt, bought, or ignorant, and also that farmers are also corrupt, bought, or ignorant.
So I just want to make clear to everyone, this has happened very intentionally. And it can be undone pretty quickly too, but we have to realize this isn't a conspiracy. It's true corruption that happened deliberately.
It's not a conspiracy, it's just intentional, and it's carried out by corrupt people who are conspiring to intentionally do it. Got it.
Because that ultra-processed foods, literally by tobacco industry scientists, hijacks our evolutionary biology. Again, you can't overeat grass-fed steak.
You can't overeat steak. What? That is just bizarre. You can overeat anything. Here's my friend Dr. Susan Oliver and what she has to say about that.
Cindy reckons she'd have no problem overeating steak if only I'd let her. Sorry, Cindy, it's not going to happen. Of course, most people couldn't overeat steak even if they wanted to because they couldn't afford to. Steak is rather expensive, so only the wealthy could eat it for every meal. But even if you had the money and the fortitude to handle the monotony of eating only steak for every meal, it still wouldn't be a good idea. High red meat consumption is associated with an increased risk of a number of different cancers, including breast cancer, endometrial cancer, colorectal cancer, lung cancer, and liver cancer. High red meat consumption is associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. High red meat consumption is associated with an increased risk of bone fracture in women. High red meat consumption, particularly unprocessed red meat like steak, for instance, is associated with an increased risk of diverticulitis. High red meat consumption is associated with an increased risk of pancreatitis. Red meat is also low in a number of essential nutrients, including vitamin C and folate. And it contains no fibre whatsoever, which not only further increases your risk of the various conditions we've just looked at, it also increases your risk of constipation and hemorrhoids, neither of which sound like a lot of fun. But what about all the anecdotes from people saying they feel great on carnivore diets? A lot of people also feel great after having a cigarette. It doesn't mean cigarettes are detrimental to your health in the long term. And just because you feel great short term on a carnivore diet, it doesn't mean it's not going to be detrimental to your health in the long term.
And then you've got the evidence-based people saying, well, we need to have a 10-year longitudinal study to show that glyphosate is causing XYZ disease. And it's like, obviously that's not the right approach.
I don't know why Casey keeps making things up about what scientists say. No, we don't say that. We already have a lot of long-term studies on the herbicides and pesticides that you're talking about. In this section of the podcast, Casey is talking about an herbicide called glyphosate, which you might have heard of. It's not banned in Europe, but Kelly and Casey go on to talk about how bad it is. Kelly says that it kills everything. No. Two of my friends sent me resources for this. They already worked really hard on compiling a ton of information on it. Dr. Andrea Love and Dr. Kevin Folta. I'm going to link their article in the description below, but I'm just going to hit on a few key points here. Glyphosate does not kill everything. It's an herbicide. It kind of only kills plants. And the reason for this is some pretty cool biochemistry. Since we are organisms that consume food, we can get essential amino acids from nature, meaning we don't have to make them ourselves. We can just consume them and use them in our metabolic processes. Plants, however, don't eat food. They have to make their own food. So plants have pathways for creating their own amino acids. These biochemical pathways have their own enzymes that are needed for the pathway to work. There's one pathway in particular called the shikimate pathway, which creates what we call aromatic amino acids. No, they don't smell good. They just have these little rings of carbon in their chemical structure, and in chemistry we call that aromatic. What glyphosate does is it blocks an enzyme in the shikimate pathway required to make these essential amino acids. When that pathway is blocked, they can't make those essential amino acids and the plants die. And again, the amount of this chemical that you're exposed to after the crops have been harvested, washed, and then washed by you or processed in any other way is minuscule. So not only is it not going to hurt your cells, it's present in really low amounts. There are tons of claims about glyphosate that you might have heard over the years, but again, those are all addressed in the article by Dr. Andrea Love and Kevin Folta. So please go check that out, and let's move on.
That's very hard to study. So we have to get our heads out of our ass and use our common sense and realize what's going on and not wait 10 years with these, NIH-funded studies that are going to be corrupted.
Wow, there it is. So it's too hard to study, so we shouldn't even try or wait for it. And even if the studies do happen, they're going to be corrupt. So just listen to vibes. Next, Casey is talking about high fructose corn syrup.
We're going to add it to ketchup. We're going to add it to children's school lunches. We're going to add it, obviously, to sodas, and we're going to make people insatiable. We're going to make their bodies and their brains think that they're preparing for winter that's never coming. And there has been research that shows that high fructose corn syrup is associated with violence, ADHD in kids, all of these different things.
No, there's no research to suggest that high fructose corn syrup makes kids manic or aggressive. There was one paper that proposed that as a hypothesis of evolutionary behavior, but it didn't actually test it, and so we can't say whether or not that hypothesis is correct or wrong. But it's a vibe to Casey to say it is, so she's going with it is, because that paper she likes. That paper, it's not corrupt. It's not bought off. So to her, it's a vibe, and it's right. Casey also will go on to say that fructose is unique in that it increases uric acid in the blood, and that somehow causes mitochondrial dysfunction and kills our cells' abilities to intake energy and use it properly.
Both books are about a molecule called uric acid, which is unique to fructose metabolism. So when fructose is metabolized in the body, not like glucose, it creates uric acid, which creates oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction in the brain and the body, that if you have mitochondrial dysfunction, you're not going to be able to process sugars to energy, mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell. So you break the mitochondria with the excess fructose, overloading the mitochondria with uric acid. And then what happens? You can't turn sugars to energy. So what do? You turn sugars to fat. So you start 3D printing fat because you break the mitochondria with excess fructose. And on top of that, the mitochondrial dysfunction and oxidative stress when happening in the brain is what may inspire the violence and the ADHD and all that stuff to make the bears manic so they get as much berries as possible. This is what's happening in every kid in every classroom in America now.
First of all, it's important to point out that high fructose corn syrup in our food supply has gone down in recent decades, and that has not affected the upward trend in obesity rates. Again, it's more about eating habits than what you eat, but that's too boring, I guess. But this claim about uric acid is just not true. So she's right that fructose can increase uric acid more than glucose, but it's not unique to fructose. The reason it happens is that when your body metabolizes fructose, which again is naturally found in lots of fruits, it requires more steps with more enzymes to break it down into components that can go into downstream metabolic steps to create energy than glucose. Glucose has only 4 steps with 4 enzymes, and fructose has 6 steps with 6 enzymes. When this much energy gets used up in a cell, it can increase a precursor to uric acid, and that's why uric acid can increase. But again, it's not unique to fructose. Things like red meat, organ meat, and alcohol consumption can also really increase your levels of uric acid in the blood. But the danger with uric acid is if your body can't excrete it fast enough and you get crystals of uric acid forming in your body, which can cause things like gout. It's not a good thing to have a high level of in your blood, but it doesn't quite do what she says it does. Maybe she should have paid more attention in biochemistry class. Just saying.
It's like with vaccines, it's like, yeah, I bet that one vaccine probably isn't causing autism. But what about the 20 that they're getting before 18 months? Like, we don't look at it in synergistic.
Well, there it is. There it is. The vaccines cause autism trope is back. Thanks, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We do test vaccines together. There are several studies that do test vaccines in combination with each other. And this study goes on in post-licensure studies as well. We have safety monitoring systems like the Vaccine Safety Data Link that do just that. And specifically in regards to autism, there are studies looking at rates of autism in children who got all of their vaccines versus children who got none. And in these studies, there is no evidence that autism rates increase with vaccination. Again, like I said, Casey, just because you can't imagine the experiment doesn't mean it can't be done, let alone it hasn't already been done. I mean, according to these people's logic, I could just show you this graph, say that organic food sales are causing autism, and say I'm just connecting dots and using my intuition, and we don't need studies, and then call it a day.
Coincidence? I think not.
And there was an amazing Lancet paper from a couple years ago that showed that if we just got on top of some of the basic modifiable factors of our metabolic health, we could slash Alzheimer's rates from happening.
She literally says this within like 10 minutes of saying that papers are either corrupt, bought off, or wrong. And now she's referencing a Lancet paper that she likes because vibes. And I don't know what Lancet paper she's talking about. She doesn't cite it, but I looked around and I can't find what she's talking about. There's evidence that dietary factors can reduce your risk of Alzheimer's, but according to this Lancet paper, the results are inconsistent. So, I don't know.
Over 100 NIH-funded Alzheimer's and Parkinson's research papers contain completely made-up data according to new allegations, billions in funding, and years of research now in serious doubt.
Okay, so this is said in the context of them talking about research being wrong and specifically the model of Alzheimer's being caused by these plaques that form in cells in the brain being wrong, and it's more about your metabolic health and diet than it is about these plaques. This was a real story where researchers from labs that were very influential were publishing data that was fabricated. I'm not a neuroscientist, but as far as I can tell in the literature, the consensus is still that these plaques do play a significant role in the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's. It's just that specifics within that model kind of got muddied and confusing because of these results being called into question. And this is a problem sometimes. Sometimes data are fabricated. Sometimes there are paper mills publishing garbage that is just complete nonsense into the scientific literature. But just like many of the problems discussed in this video, there's no quick fix or easy solution to it. You just have to kind of do the work to actually read the papers and assess them. You have to actually read and understand the data, not just read the abstract and look at the limitation section or the funding section like a lot of people do. And you have to actually read and assess the data for lots of different papers in a given field to see if the data are consistent with one another. Because if lots of people from lots of different labs are finding the same thing all over the world independent of each other, then that is going to build a much stronger case for whatever conclusions are being formed. And that's what good scientists do. When a scientist first joins a lab, typically they'll spend their first week of work just reading papers, getting themselves up to speed on the field, and what has been done, what hasn't been done, what work can be done to build on the field, what new discoveries there are to make, and what experiments can be done to make those new discoveries. But then the reading process extends into the scientist's whole career. There are constantly papers being published from groups all over the world, and reading papers, assessing data, and figuring out what the conclusions are, it's a constant job in a scientist's life. And I encourage you to listen to those scientists. Do try to read their work. I understand reading technical scientific papers is challenging. It's not always feasible for the average person, but there are other avenues you can use to listen to these scientists who are doing this work. I'm thinking podcasts like Ologies or This Week in Virology or Shortwave from NPR. Even articles written on news sites like sciencemag.org or nature.com. Those are going to give you a much better idea of what scientists are actually talking about, thinking about, and doing than listening to these podcasts like Joe Rogan. I mean, honestly, it really will give you a much better idea because you're not getting the scientific community, you're not getting the data, you're not getting what's actually going on these podcasts. Those are just some of the sources that I like to use to keep up on science news, but you should post your favorite in the comments.
But RFK, really, I think better than anyone alive, is sharpening this issue. So
this is a problem. And I think it's probably the most obvious problem that you can point out with the MAHA movement. RFK Jr. is just not your guy to make America healthy again, or let alone keep America healthy. The guy is extremely anti-vaccine. He spent decades telling people that vaccines are dangerous, lying to people about vaccine ingredients, lying to people about the vaccine's effectiveness, lying to people who ended up losing their lives or their children's lives. Take, for example, the measles outbreak in Samoa in 2019. If you ask him about it, he'll say he had nothing to do with it, and he'll even say it was because of faulty vaccines. But what actually happened is that the measles vaccination rate dropped from 74% down to 31% in 2018. This drop in vaccination rate came after 2 children tragically died when nurses resuspended the contents of an MMR vaccine in muscle relaxant instead of saline. It's not clear if this was malicious by the nurses or just an accident, but the outcome was 2 children died. And as a result of that, a lot of fear around vaccinations exploded in Samoa, and that caused vaccination rates to drop. But amidst those dropping vaccination rates, RFK Jr. used that as an opportunity to spread misinformation. He visited Samoa on a trip organized by some local anti-vaccine advocates, gave talks there, and just generally doing what he always did in the past 20 years is spread vaccine misinformation. Then in 2019, a measles outbreak happened, which ended up killing 83 kids. And in the midst of this, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had the gall to write the Prime Minister of Samoa and oppose vaccines. Thankfully, the Prime Minister did not listen, and a mass measles vaccination campaign ensued, and the outbreak was eventually controlled. His position here is indefensible, which is why now, instead of being overtly anti-vaccine, he's sliding it under this veiled concern for childhood chronic disease, when in reality he thinks a lot of these problems are from vaccination. A future of a healthy America requires vaccines. It has no place for infectious diseases that used to have devastating effects on children. Children dying of diseases like measles or diphtheria, being rendered deaf by diseases like mumps or rubella, being paralyzed by polio, suffering horrible disease from Haemophilus influenza B, getting sent to the hospital with pneumonia from RSV, from flu, from COVID, dying of dehydration from rotavirus. None of these things have a place in a future of a healthy America, especially when they are preventable. But Kennedy would want to tear all of that down under this veiled guise of a concern for children getting autism after vaccines and getting chronic disease from vaccines, none of which has any grounds in scientific literature. It's frankly embarrassing for the human race and ridiculous for podcasts such as Joe Rogan to favorably platform such ideas so confidently when it's just so wrong.
You exercise, you're called, you're far right.
Am I right wing? Is Fauci right wing? Is Terry Crews right wing? That is such a just out of touch, weird thing to say.
I can't stress this enough. Just let Americans choose. Give the Americans the information. Fearlessly. Let's give them the information on diabetes. Let's give them the information on obesity. Let's give them the information on the 72 vaccines. Let's give them the information on everything and trust the American people.
You can't fearlessly give the American people information and trust them to do the right thing when you're not giving them the right information. How can people have freedom of choice when they don't understand the choices that they're making? Misinforming people is the opposite of empowering them. And Callie and Casey here are definitely not empowering people.
The food has tens of thousands of molecular components in it that work miraculously with our cells to generate health. And right now, the average piece of food, 67% of our calories are ultra-processed food, totally dead, totally stripped of all those miraculous nutrients. So we are literally eating dead food that has lost all of its magic that is God-given for us to have cells that function properly.
All right, we're coming to the end of this review. We're going to end with this dead food idea that Casey explains here. All right, people need to just stop thinking that foods are inherently good or bad. Foods that are considered bad are bad because it's easy to overeat them, not because they're toxic or dead, as Casey says. This is also true with processed or ultra-processed foods. First of all, we have to be clear that when it comes to processing and ultra-processing, there aren't really standard definitions for those words. So just be careful using those terms and applying them to swaths of food because it might not apply to all of them. And it's because processing foods applies to just so many different techniques. Things like pickling, fermenting, freezing, canning, all of these things are process. And there certainly isn't a linear correlation between processing and the amount of nutrients in a food. When it comes to studies showing foods like ultra-processed foods are bad for you, it's important to recognize that people who are more likely to consume ultra-processed foods are also more likely to be in poverty or more likely to overeat and consume more calories overall, thus gaining more weight and being more prone to chronic diseases. Again, healthy eating habits are hugely important here. And in the spirit of being honest with people and just giving them the data, just say, yeah, ultra-processed foods and processed foods can have nutrients and be good for you, but they can also be easy to overeat. So be careful about how much you eat and make sure you exercise. You don't need to make up this story about how the nutrients die and your body can't use them and so then you get sick. It's just weird.
Below all of this, above all of this, which is that our life is a miracle. It is a miracle that we are here, that you're here, that I'm alive, that Callie's alive, that we're all here. It is so insane.
I agree. It's pretty crazy that we're just here. Existing, it's pretty dope. No, but seriously, it is amazing. It's incredible that I'm here and my cells are doing all of this work all in real time to make me talk and keep me alive and have me breathe and send signals to my brain. And it's incredible. But it's also something we can study and figure out how it works and be amazed at the complexity of how these things work. We don't have to invent magic or go off of vibes to make important decisions. We can use science to figure things out and make life better for us. and that's what we should do. Science is a process of moving forward. It's a process of asking questions and then designing experiments to get answers to those questions. And sometimes the answers are complicated, sometimes the answers are really clear. For example, it's really clear that if we lie and tell people that vaccines are dangerous, then that's going to cause a lot of harm and suffering. Sometimes even the answer is simple, but the action to act upon that answer is really complicated. Not overeating things and being active enough is a simple action, but it's not easy for everybody to do consistently. I agree with them that companies are not making it any easier for Americans. There are way too many calorie-rich foods with low nutrient density. It would be great if we subsidized healthy foods more and not things like just corn. There are some truths and valid points being brought up, but these are not new ideas, and they're being slid in with a bunch of misinformation and downright dangerous things like anti-vax rhetoric. So this is just my little effort to try to bring you good information from experts who know the data and can communicate the data to you. The people who helped give information and data and explanations for this video are credited on the screen now. I'm putting their information in the description below, along with some of their socials. Please check them out if you're interested in learning more about science and what it says and doesn't say. I do hope you found this video informative, and as always, thank you for watching. So with that, I hope you all take care, do what you can to make healthy choices, and do what you can to inform yourself. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.